He watched her, controlled her schedule, but over time, old secrets came to light, revealing that the greatest danger was where she least expected it. It was a cold morning in Hamburg when Hanna, a 62-year-old woman, got up with aching joints and a tiredness that seemed to weigh not only on her body, but on her soul. The routine had become a prison for a long time, and she wondered how many dreams she had stopped living. Her husband, Klaus, a millionaire and authoritarian businessman, had never given her the freedom she needed. As she prepared coffee, memories of her youth came in flashes. Hanna was a woman who, in her youth, loved music, travel, and a taste for books that made her dream of a different life. But the reality next to Klaus was different. He was a meticulous man who made a point of controlling everything, even the time she spent on the phone with her friends or the distance she walked to the park. Klaus still worked in his luxurious office room, full of relics he had accumulated throughout his life, but Hanna had stopped being impressed by all that luxury decades ago. To her, the fine wood furniture and expensive artwork only represented an elegant prison. That morning, when she opened her email, she found a detailed to-do list sent by Klaus himself. He never failed to send, as if she were an employee under his command. But something about the way he treated her was starting to wear down what little strength he had left in his heart. "How did I end up here?" she whispered to herself, as she leafed through the instructions on how to take care of the house, the servants, and even the grocery shopping. What Klaus didn't know was that Hanna had started taking piano lessons in secret, something she always wanted, but he never allowed. At a small adult school on the corner of the street, she met people who reminded her of her passion for music. Those stolen moments were the only ones that made her feel alive. But that morning, as she finished her tea, Hanna noticed something different. There was a strange noise coming from the garage. As he got out, he saw Klaus maneuvering a new sports car, shining brightly in the dim morning light. He always had plans, and even with his advanced age, his look was still that of a man who knew how to manipulate. "Surprise," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's go on a trip." "Don't ask me fate." Hanna froze. Traveling with Klaus was never an invitation, but an order. His heart sped up. Something told him that this trip would not be a simple stroll. There, in his eyes, was a secret greater than the control he exercised over his life. Hanna tried to hide the anxiety that welled in her chest. Traveling with Klaus always brought a feeling of insecurity. He was unpredictable, and even after 40 years of marriage, she never knew what to expect. The word surprise, coming from him, was not synonymous with something good, but with something that would require her patience and strength. She entered her room and began to pack her bags with shaking hands. He folded his clothes slowly, feeling the weight of the emotional baggage he had been carrying long before that trip. The memory of happy moments, which had long since disappeared, weighed more than any fabric or object. The innocent love of youth, the promises of a future together, had turned into an existence regulated by clocks and rules. Klaus appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. 15 minutes, he said. "We are late." It was always like this. Everything had to be calculated, controlled. She nodded, without arguing, as she had done for years. But inside, a small flame of revolt began to grow. On the way to the car, Hanna noticed the beauty of the garden she cared for with so much care. The flowers, carefully chosen by her, bloomed even on gray days, and somehow represented the hope she still had. Before getting into the car, she took a deep breath, absorbing the peace of that scene, knowing that it would be the last vision of tranquility before what awaited her. The journey began in silence. Klaus, with his hands firmly on the steering wheel, seemed more focused than ever. He didn't explain his destination. He just drove at high speed, leaving the familiar streets of Hamburg behind and heading inland. The verdant landscape of Germany passed by in a blur, and Hanna began to wonder if this was just another of her husband's whims, or if there was something darker behind the urgency. "We're going to our country house," he said abruptly, without looking at her. That house, isolated in the mountains, had been a luxurious retreat, but also the setting for some of the loneliest moments of Hanna's life. She hated that place, where nature seemed to swallow up any hope of escape or freedom. Klaus loved isolation, and it made her feel even more trapped. As the car climbed the winding road, Hanna remembered the last time they were here. It had been the previous fall, and the discussion about money and the control it had over her life still echoed in her mind. Klaus not only took care of the finances, but also made sure Hanna didn't have direct access to anything. He always said, "For your safety," but she knew it was just an excuse to keep her under his control. "We have a lot to discuss, Hanna," Klaus said, breaking the silence. The tone of his voice was filled with a coldness that she knew well. Her heart raced, but she hid it, looking at the mountains as the car drove forward. There was something dark behind that trip, and Hanna felt like she would need all the strength she had built up in secret. She looked at her hands and, in thought, remembered the song she had recently practiced. She closed her eyes and, for a brief moment, played the piano in her mind, searching for strength that maybe, this time, could help her face Klaus in a way she never had before. The car snaked through the mountainous roads, the engine roaring every time Klaus accelerated around a sharp curve. Hanna kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if that gesture could calm the whirlwind of thoughts that assaulted her. Outside, the sky was beginning to cover itself with dense clouds, threatening rain. The mood matched the tension that seemed to emanate from Klaus, radiating throughout the vehicle. She knew something was wrong, more wrong than usual. He was tense, the muscles in his jaw clenched as he stared at the road with a fixed gaze. Hanna tried to divert her mind from the growing restlessness, trying to remember the few moments of happiness she still had left. The piano lessons, the friends she had made at the little school on the corner. These were the fragments of a life that she was slowly trying to rebuild, even under Klaus' relentless control. At one point, he finally spoke, but without taking his eyes off the road. "You know why we're going to the cottage, don't you?" His tone was more of an accusation than a question. Hanna felt a shiver run down her spine, but she remained calm. She knew that if she showed fear or weakness, he would notice and use it against her. "No, Klaus," she replied softly. "You never told me." There was something about the controlled way she spoke, an almost passive tone that she had learned to adopt over the years. It was a shield, a form of protection against his outbursts of anger or manipulation. But inside, his mind was alert, trying to anticipate what would come next. He laughed harshly, a sound that made her shudder. "We're going there because I need to discuss finances," he said, his voice cold. "The market is not good, and we need to think of ways to save. Maybe sell the house, maybe reduce costs." Hanna looked at him, trying to find some sign that this was just an excuse. Sell the country house? It was strange. Klaus had never talked about parting with his precious possessions. He always regarded properties as trophies, symbols of his victory over childhood poverty. She hesitated, feeling that there was something more behind those words. "If that's what you think is best," she murmured, but fear was beginning to eat away at her strength. Klaus heard the doubt in her tone. His eyes narrowed, and he turned his face briefly toward her, his expression hardened. "You don't hide anything from me, do you, Hanna?" He questioned suddenly, with a voice as sharp as a blade. The question took her by surprise, and her heart started to beat faster. "What do you mean?" she responded, trying to maintain control. But he didn't answer her right away. Instead, he accelerated further, the car shaking as he climbed the road that led to the top of the hill, where the cottage stood alone. They arrived at their destination when the first drop of rain began to fall. The country house, built of ancient stones and surrounded by dense trees, looked like a castle of dark memories. Klaus parked the car and got out first, slamming the door. Hanna slowly descended, observing the clouds that now covered the entire sky, making the environment even heavier. Inside the house, the air was cold and stuffy. Klaus lit the fireplace in the main room, throwing the pieces of wood into the fire with sudden gestures. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to a nearby armchair. Hanna obeyed, but her entire body was tense, as if expecting an attack. He sat in the chair across from her, his eyes taking in every detail of her face. "I found some strange documents in our last joint account," he began, his voice dangerously low. "Money transfers that I did not authorize. Receipts that made no sense." Hanna froze. He was talking about the savings she was secretly trying to save for a future without him. Her freedom project was threatened, and now it was in front of her, represented by the man who never let her escape. She knew she needed to be careful. If he suspected what she was planning, he could react unpredictably. "You take care of everything, Klaus. I don't even have direct access to these things," she replied, her voice sounding calm even though her hands were beginning to sweat. But he didn't seem convinced. He stood up suddenly and began walking around the room, like a predator stalking its prey. "Lies," he muttered. "I know you've been doing things behind my back." He turned to face her. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She tried to contain the panic that threatened to escape her eyes. He knew more than he should have, and what she feared was happening. She wasn't prepared for a confrontation at that moment. He took a step toward her, and fear filled his mind. But suddenly, an unexpected sound broke the tension. A piano played softly in the background, a melody she recognized immediately. It was the song she had been practicing at school. She froze, confused. How was it possible? He looked at Klaus, who also looked perplexed. They exchanged a quick glance, but before they could react, the door to the house opened with a bang. The door to the cottage opened with such force that it banged against the wall, echoing through the cold, damp room. Klaus turned around immediately, his body rigid and his eyes wide with surprise. Hanna, on the other hand, felt an even more intense chill run down her spine. For a second, the silence seemed to stretch infinitely until firm footsteps entered the room, echoing on the aged wooden floor. A tall man, with gray hair and a stern look, entered the room. He was wearing a heavy coat, still damp from the rain that was falling outside, and he had the posture of someone used to facing confrontations. Hanna didn't recognize him right away, but Klaus' expression changed from surprise to something close to panic. "Werner?" Klaus spluttered, his voice shaking slightly. Hanna watched, intrigued, as the mysterious man advanced deeper into the room, never taking his eyes off Klaus. "Yes, Klaus," Werner replied, his voice deep and cold. "You didn't think I'd forget so easily, did you?" What was happening? Hanna looked from one to the other, trying to understand the dynamics between these two men. It was evident that there was an old and bitter history between them, but Klaus had never mentioned this Werner. "You have no right to be here," Klaus replied, but his voice sounded weaker, as if he knew his authority had no effect on the man invading his sanctuary. Werner let out a short, bitter laugh. "Right? Do you still dare to talk about law after what you did?" The tension in the room was so thick it seemed impossible to breathe. Hanna, still sitting in the armchair, felt her anguish increase with each second. Werner turned to her, and his eyes softened for a moment. "I'm sorry to have to invade your life like this, ma'am," he said, respectfully. "But you have the right to know who the man you spent all these years with really is." Hanna looked at Klaus, who was now in a defensive position, like a cornered animal. Curiosity began to overcome the fear within her. There was so much she had never known about her husband, so much he hid. But he had never imagined that secrets could be accompanied by such a direct threat. "Well, what's going on?" Hanna managed to ask, her voice almost cracking. Werner pulled a thick envelope from inside his coat and threw it on the table in front of Klaus. "That's what's happening," he said. Klaus looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. With hands shaking, he bent down and opened the package, scattering the documents on the table. Hanna leaned forward, trying to see what it was, and her eyes widened as she realized what they were: bank documents, transfer records, and, most shocking, a detailed dossier on money laundering. "These are the proofs, Klaus. Evidence that you used your fortune to hide illicit money, diverting funds to a scheme that destroyed many lives. Lives like mine," Werner said, and his voice was filled with pain. Hanna looked at Klaus, not believing what she was seeing. The man she had lived with for 40 years was not just controlling. He was a criminal. She felt a tightness in her chest, as if her entire world was falling apart. Klaus began to back away, sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You have no way of proving that legally," he said, but his tone betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. Werner took another step towards him. "But I do, and I have already handed everything over to the authorities." Klaus paled, and Hanna felt the room spin. He was not just a cruel man. This was someone who had destroyed lives in the name of his greed. Werner turned to Hanna again, and his eyes were filled with compassion. "I'm sorry you were dragged into this man's hell," he said, "but you deserve to know the truth." Hanna could barely process what she was hearing. All those years of submission and suffering, and now a revelation that turned Klaus into someone even more dangerous than she could ever imagine. "I'm leaving now," Werner continued. "I just came to bring the evidence and give you a warning. Get out of this house. The police will be here soon, and I don't want you to be dragged along." Klaus turned sharply, his face a mix of despair and anger. "You are lying. This is a conspiracy." But Hanna knew it wasn't a lie. Klaus' behavior, the fear in his eyes, everything confirmed the truth. Something inside her began to release. A weight she didn't know she was carrying began to dissolve. Werner turned to leave, and Hanna, still in shock, slowly got up. Before she could react, Klaus lunged towards her, his eyes wild. "You're not going anywhere, understand? You're mine, and I can still fix this." He grabbed her arm tightly, but before he could do more, Werner stepped between them, holding Klaus with surprising strength for a man his age. "Enough, Klaus," he said. "You lost." Klaus struggled violently, but Werner was strong and determined to protect Hanna. The physical struggle between the two men made the room seem even smaller, as if the walls were closing in around them. Hanna took a few steps back, her heart beating frantically. All he wanted was to escape this nightmare, but his legs felt paralyzed, anchored by fear and the shock of the entire situation. Werner finally managed to push Klaus against the wall, pinning him with a strength that seemed to have been fueled by years of built-up anger. "You've done enough harm," Werner growled, his voice filled with a spite that Hanna didn't fully understand. Klaus, now breathless and wide-eyed, seemed to know he was cornered, but he still tried to reverse the situation, forcing a maniacal smile. "Ah, Werner," Klaus said, his voice wavering between contempt and despair. "You think you won, don't you? You think you're going to destroy everything I built?" He turned to Hanna, who was still frozen in place, her eyes wide. "And you, Hanna," he continued, with a bitter laugh. "Are you going to betray me too? Are you going to abandon me now that everything is falling apart?" Hanna felt heat rise through her body, a mixture of indignation and finally, release. All those years of control, of humiliation, of fear, the farce was over. She took a step forward, her knees still shaking, but her voice coming out stronger than she expected. "I'm not the one cheating on you, Klaus," she said, with newfound strength. "You destroyed everything by yourself. And now it's over." Klaus' expression changed. Something faded in his eyes, as if the last vestige of control had disappeared. He let go of Werner's hands and fell heavily into the nearest chair, his gaze blank. He looked like a defeated man, but the atmosphere was still charged with tension. Werner moved away, staying in position to protect Hanna in case Klaus tried anything. The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. Hanna heard the increasing noise of police cars approaching on the dirt road. She looked at Werner, who nodded, as if to confirm that they had done the right thing. But there was still something Hanna needed to know. She turned to Werner, her voice thick with confusion and exhaustion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her eyes teary. "Who are you really? Why care what happens to me and Klaus?" Werner looked at her for a moment, the pain in his eyes reflecting an untold story. He took a deep breath, as if mustering the courage to speak was as difficult as everything they had faced that night. "I do this because Klaus didn't just destroy your life, Hanna," Werner began, his voice breaking. "He destroyed mine too many years ago." He looked at Klaus, now motionless in the chair, with a mix of sadness and anger. "My wife. She trusted Klaus with our finances when he was starting to make money. He deceived her, made false promises, and when everything fell apart, she lost everything. The pressure, the humiliation, it was too much for her, and I lost the love of my life." Hanna put her hand over her mouth, horrified. She didn't know that Klaus was capable of so much cruelty, of destroying lives in such a cold and calculated way. Werner continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I promised myself I would never let anyone else go through what she went through. I followed Klaus every step, waiting for the day I could get justice. And today is that day. Tears ran down Hanna's face. Werner's suffering mirrored her own pain in ways she could never have imagined. Klaus' dark past was even deeper and full of suffering than she knew. But now, finally, there was a sense of justice in the air. The sirens got closer and closer, and blue and red lights began to illuminate the interior of the cottage. The police rushed in, surrounding Klaus and unceremoniously handcuffing him. He did not resist, seeming to have lost all strength to fight. He just gave Hanna one last look, a mix of resentment and despair. "You were never strong without me," he whispered, but Hanna no longer cared. His words no longer had power over her. When Klaus was taken outside, the storm finally began to rage, as if the sky wept for past sorrows. Werner looked at Hanna with a mix of sadness and relief. "Now's your chance, Hanna," he said softly, "to live the life you always deserved." She nodded, still processing everything, but with a growing sense that freedom was finally within her reach. Hanna left the house with Werner by her side, feeling the rain wash away the weight of all the years of suffering. It was the end of an era of fear, and the beginning of something that she still didn't fully understand, but that she knew, with all the certainty in the world, would be better. A future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed full of hope. The rain fell heavily, soaking Hanna and Werner as they stood outside the cottage, watching the police take Klaus away. The lights of the vehicles flashed, reflecting in the puddles of water that were beginning to form on the dirt road. For the first time in decades, Hanna felt the crushing weight she carried begin to dissolve. There was still pain, there were still scars, but with them came a freedom that was almost incomprehensible. Werner, next to her, shifted uncomfortably. He looked relieved, but also deeply tired. Time and struggle had left their marks, but his face carried a mix of serenity and sadness. He looked at Hanna, and a tender but exhausted smile formed on his lips. "You're free now," he said, his voice soft and blending with the sound of the rain. Hanna felt tears mixing with the water running down her face. They were not only of sadness, but also of relief, of a feeling of completion she never thought she would achieve. "Thank you," she replied, her voice breaking, "for everything. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough." Werner nodded slightly, as if saying he didn't need thanks. What he had done was both an act of justice and honor to his own memory and to the love he had lost in the past. The environment around them began to calm down. The rain, although still intense, seemed to wash more than the earth. It seemed to purify years of fear and suffering, leaving behind only the promise of new beginnings. Hanna took a deep breath, feeling the cool, moist air fill her lungs. It was almost like a rebirth, a new chance for her to finally live without the shackles of a love that was never true, of a life marked by manipulation and pain. Werner watched her for a moment, then looked at the road in front of him. "You know," he said, almost as if he was thinking out loud, "sometimes life gives you second chances in unexpected ways." Hanna followed his gaze, her heart beginning to slow from its frantic pace. "Do you have any plans now that this is all over?" Werner asked, a slight tone of curiosity in his voice. Hanna shook her head slowly. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I spent so much time living the life Klaus wanted for me that I don't even know where to start on my own. But I want to meet my friends, I want to travel, I want to connect with my family again." She laughed, a sound that seemed long forgotten. "I even want to learn to paint, like I've always dreamed of, without anyone telling me it's a waste of time." Werner smiled. "That sounds wonderful. Maybe it's time to rediscover everything you left aside." He hesitated for a moment, then continued, "I'm also trying to find my way back to life. Maybe if you need company, we can rediscover it together." The suggestion was simple, but it carried a world of possibilities. Hanna looked at him, surprised but also touched by the offer. There was something comforting and solid about Werner, someone who understood her pain, but also the strength she would need to move forward. "I would like that," she replied, feeling a new hope dawn. It wasn't an immediate romance. It wasn't something that could replace what she lost, but it was the promise of something genuine, based on respect and understanding. The police officers began to disperse, and one of them approached to inform them that Klaus would be taken to the city police station. Hanna nodded, watching as the man who had haunted her for so long disappeared into the police car, handcuffed and defeated. It was a strange but necessary moment. She didn't know what the future held for him, but she knew that it was finally no longer her future that depended on him. When the last vehicle left, Hanna and Werner remained on the deserted road, with the rain beginning to ease. Hanna looked up at the sky, where the clouds were beginning to part, letting small rays of light pass through. It was almost poetic, as if even the universe was marking a turning point in his life. "Let's go home," Werner suggested gently. Hanna nodded. Yes, she was ready to go home, but this time was different. It was her home now, not the place where she had to hide from a painful reality. It was the beginning of a new phase, of a new freedom that she was still learning to embrace. With Werner at her side, she turned and began walking back, her feet firmly in the mud of the road, but her heart lighter than it had been in many years. Ready for a new beginning like Hanna's? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to hit the like button, share this story with someone who needs a spark of hope, and subscribe for more powerful tales of courage and freedom. See you in the next story.